Ukraine says hundreds of graves have been found outside Izyum, a city that was recently recaptured from Russian forces. Let's take a look now at other news. And the authorities in Ukraine say they found a large burial site containing more than 400 graves in a city recently recaptured from Russian forces. Ukrainian officials say most of the graves contain the remains of civilians, but there were also some soldiers with their hands bound. They were discovered in Izyum in the east of the country, which the Russians used as a logistics hub for their war effort. Ukraine says all the bodies will be exhumed and sent for forensic examination. Speaking of the discovery, President Zelensky said Russia leaves death everywhere. Ukraine has recently made some major military gains, and these circled areas show where the most significant fighting has been taking place over the last 2 days. Our senior international correspondent Orla Guerin sent this report from Izyum, and some of the content you may find distressing.
Under the pine trees of Izyum, a war crimes investigation. This burial site has more than 400 graves, now being exhumed, the earth starting to give up its secrets. But the prosecutor here already claiming that Russia is responsible for almost all of the dead. According to our data, almost everyone died because of Russian soldiers, says Alexander Filchakov. Some were killed, some were tortured, some were hit in Russian air and artillery strikes. He says the very first grave they opened contained the body of a civilian with a rope around his neck. This knife was recovered from the remains of a soldier. A senior official told us more than 20 troops were found in a single grave, with signs of torture. Some had their hands bound. For those at the scene, it was hard to take. This is a distressing sight, but Ukraine is determined that the world should see it. Graves are being opened here one by one. It's only now, after the Russians have been pushed out, that the authorities can really investigate and can establish how many victims they left behind. They were buried here in makeshift graves, many marked only with a number. Among them, a 65-year-old called Ludmila, who was killed in March in heavy Russian shelling. Her husband Grigory tells me then he had to bury her in the yard. She was brought here in August. Now her remains will be disturbed again. She was beloved, he says. We had no children. God didn't give us that gift, but we were in love. Emergency service workers drained by their labours. We can't be sure what killed all of those buried here, but they expect to be digging at more sites like this in areas recently taken back from the Russians. Orla Guerin, BBC News, Izyum.
Well, joining me now is our international editor, Jeremy Bowen. And as Orla says there, we can't be sure what has happened.
No, as she pointed out, it is very hard to establish what exactly occurred months ago now, and why those people were killed, how they were killed. Even if many of them are civilians, civilians do get killed in warfare. It is not necessarily a war crime. It depends on the circumstances. Now, it sounds, judging by people being tied together and bundled into a grave, that seems very suspicious to me in terms of the way that people behave after they've carried out a massacre. However, I would say, having reported on the aftermath of many massacres over the years, it is rather unusual to see, after a massacre, lines of marked graves with numbers on. It means someone was registering them and they were treating them with a certain amount of respect. Normally speaking, after a massacre, they dig a big pit, push the bodies in, cover them over and hope no one's going to find them for a while.
Let's just have a look at the area where this happened, Jeremy. Izyum, in the east of the country. You can see it there. Just remind us why Izyum is so important.
Well, it's a strategic town that the Russians captured, and for them it was a very important part of their initial military push into Ukraine when they were hoping to take over the entire country. So in terms of what the victory there means, I think it works on a couple of levels. First of all, on the battlefield level, they've gained territory, the Ukrainians. They've shown they're agile. They've shown they can go on the offensive, use these sophisticated new weapons they've been given and the intelligence. On the Russian side, it shows that baked into what they do is really a high degree of lack of military competence on intelligence, on command and control, on logistics, on the morale of their men in the field, who didn't really fight, as far as one can tell, around there. They left as quickly as they could, trying to save themselves. Those are really serious problems for Putin. Now, on the other level, is a bigger thing. It's what it says about Russia's war overall. And what it says is that President Putin is in trouble over this. One American retired general used a phrase, I think, irreversible momentum gathering towards a Ukrainian victory. I think too early to say that. But in terms of the way this plays with Putin's allies, like notably President Xi of China, who he's been seeing at a summit in Uzbekistan in the last couple of days. Now, Xi did not talk at all about Ukraine in his public statements. And Putin as well said, I know you have some misgivings about what's going on. I mean, extraordinary change in the kind of rhetoric he comes out with. And so while this is not over, I think that this counts as a major turning point in the war, which the Ukrainians will try to exploit. One last thing, one risk that potentially they face is if they try and overextend their advance, they could get cut off and be open to a counterattack.